Hello, everyone. Happy weekend. It's Mike Brock again, back on the Substack Live platform, also streaming on YouTube and X. Quite a week. But I'm not going to talk much about current events today. There's certainly a lot to talk about, and I will talk about that. I'll probably do a Substack Live tomorrow as well, Sunday at the circus. Or maybe we'll talk more about current events. Want to have a more intellectual topic today, which is really my passion, right? It's why I started the Substack originally. It is, after all, a philosophy blog. So let's talk a little bit about let's talk about political philosophy today. I think like political philosophy is really important because you know, I mean, I think a lot of people who might think it's not important will still find themselves calling themselves liberals or calling themselves socialists or calling themselves Marxists or democratic socialists or libertarians, communitarians, anarchists, anarcho-capitalists, syndicalists, all these things, right? And when you say something like that, you're invoking philosophy. You're saying this is my philosophy. So when someone says they're a liberal, what does that mean? I mean, I say I'm a liberal. I think I am. I think I would situate myself in what I sometimes refer to as the classical tradition. I hate calling it that, right? Because I think it is a tradition. It's a several century old tradition of a way of a philosophy that's based on a few core principles. And I've written about this, right? I wrote a piece recently, The Two Materialisms: Why I'm a Liberal. Talk a little bit about that today. We'll get back into that. I messed around with some categories and terms there that kind of go against sort of the typical philosophical canon that one might find in a philosophy department in the academy. I make no apologies for that. I think I have some opinions on certain normative categories in the sort of like mainstream philosophical canon, and so I make no apologies for playing around there with categories, because I think there's some things there that are often sort of uninterrogated in the conversation around sort of thinking about these things. We'll talk a little bit about that, and I think like one of the ways to sort of see, why one might say care a little bit about the metaphysical and metaethical arguments, as opposed to just sort of the kind of this reified normative ethical frameworks that we sort of associate in the sort of philosophical canon of liberalism, right? So like there's certain ways in which liberalism is categorized. Classical liberalism, you've heard of neoliberalism, modern liberalism, which modern liberalism is sort of sometimes it's hard actually to sort of disentangle modern liberalism from democratic socialism or social democracy, or third way socialism. There's a kind of interesting property there that when you sort of like take these things sort of like really from like a consequentialist standpoint, it's like hard to kind of tell the difference. Like it just kind of seems like you're really choosing like what you really want to sort of historically emphasize, what sort of maybe for like romantic or aesthetic reasons, like why you might call yourself sort of a liberal Democrat, sort of a modern liberal, progressive liberal versus a democratic socialist. Um, you know, I mean, lots of, not that there isn't like disagreement with like in those spaces, but like, but we're gonna talk about sort of, moral categories, right? Ethical categories that we sort of use to construct these political frameworks. We're going to talk about like the differences. Like, what is the difference between liberalism and socialism? Um, and or like Marxism sort of an interesting beast because it does have its own sort of metaphysics, right? Dialectical materialism, and it has sort of a theory of history, historical materialism, which I would say I'm a big critic of. I think it makes a bunch of errors, philosophical errors. Marxists will disagree with me on this, and they have. I had some people comment on my piece. I don't want to litigate that because that's getting really into the weeds. But I want to talk about like sort of the practical categories that we sort of think about in modern American political life, right? Um, and and sometimes philosophers, it's sort of you know like we can argue about what a word means to until the cow comes home, and there really is like a problem, right, when talking about politics and moral philosophy, like how to sort of talk about it with you know people who aren't familiar with the philosophical canon, because in American political discourse, very liberal means the same as socialist to most Americans. That which I mean, to like a from a political philosophy perspective, that doesn't make much sense to me. Like that's incoherent. But that's how most Americans use that language, which is unfortunate because when you I mean, we reason around categories. This is how human reasoning. This is what abstract reasoning is, right? So, um, our brains generate abstractions, categories. Words are example of this, and then we reason around them, right? Through sort of like higher order cognition on these abstract categories. We do abstract reasoning. And we can do these things because these categories are sort of stable representations of what, say, philosopher Daniel Dennett would call real patterns in the universe. And then, and we can talk about, and there's problems there, right? And, if you're philosophically trained, right, you're probably thinking about Wittgenstein right now, and word games and the problems, and words sort of suffer from the problem that all categories do in philosophy. They are always they're always like never perfectly definable. They often suffer from another problem in philosophy known as the Socrates paradox. This is an interesting one, that is can is demonstrated through a sort of a thought experiment, right? And that thought experiment is when does sort of a you know a pile become a heap, and when does a heap become a hill, and when does a hill become a mountain, right? And you think about this, right? And that doesn't like seem on the surface to be like that interesting of a problem. You're like, look, I can tell the difference between a hill and a mountain by just looking at it. Well, so the Socrates paradox sort of says, okay, well, fine, surely trust your intuition, but think about this for a moment. If you imagine both of the mountain and the hill, and then the mound and then the heap, sort of in this sort of they all kind of exist on a spectrum, right? Because if you pile enough material high enough, you will get a mountain. But yet, like, we wouldn't say that a handful of sand dropped on the ground is a mountain. So we're describing essentially the same phenomenon at different scales. Then the question is like, well, what is the point? So if we start adding one grain of sand, one at a time, like eventually we get a little pile of sand. We keep adding more and more and more, one grain of sand at a time. Eventually we'll get to something we'll say is a heap of sand. But like, what is the number of grains of sand that makes up the upper limit of the category that we would call a pile? And then what's the number of grains of sand? What's the minimum number of grains of sand that you need to call it a heap? And it turns out, because look, if you believe that every word you speak and every sort of like description is precise, then it should be the case that you can give me the numbers of sand to give me the exact precise meaning of that word. And it turns out it's a paradox, because it doesn't really quite work that way, does it? When you start to think about it. So this is a limitation of words. So famous philosopher Wittgenstein really, did some really important philosophy here on thinking about this. And we can demonstrate this, like, until the cows come home. There's just infinite examples. I don't want to exhaust you on this, because this would be about political philosophy. But when we say, like, what does liberal mean, it suffers from the same problem, right? Like, or what is socialism? I described, like, kind of a way in which there's sort of what a convergent definition from these sort of subcategories, which is you have this sort of kind of weird sort of like epistemic reentrancy there from these higher level categories. And I'm talking, this is talking in the language of epistemics, and I'm probably losing a lot of people, but words matter, right? They because when we use words to reason about things, we're doing that so we can make like decisions about our life. So if you're a liberal and liberalism matters to you, then you're reasoning about the world in relationship to those values, in relationship to those liberal values. And so when you're talking with other people and trying to, understand, through social interactions with other human beings, what kinds of arguments and actions and relations to your fellow citizens, lead to, and through persuasion and and demonstration and action and ethical commitment, advance those values. So I think words are important. I don't think that so. I don't think that should be controversial. So when someone says, like, who cares if they call it liberal, or who cares if they call it socialist? Well, I mean, it matters. Maybe it doesn't matter to you, right? In terms of like, look, like if I'm a liberal and Zoran Mondani says he's a socialist, and we both want the same things, who cares what you call yourself? That would be the sort of like obvious like reason to dismiss this. But then you have to sort of think about like the broader public conversation and the way in which sort of opposing forces characterize you in arguments to people who do care about those words. So you have, for example, the Cuban expatriate community in Florida, right? When they hear socialism, that's a very scary word for very good reasons, because socialism to them is associated with, the Cuban regime, the the communist revolution there. And when they see someone like Mamdani, they see someone that is like Fidel Castro. Now, educated sort of people in the liberal arts generally, if you've taken some basic political philosophy and political history, can well understand that this is not true, right? That Mamdani is not a Fidel Castro like figure, certainly not Che Guevara like figure. He does not romanticize violence in the way that Guevara did. In service of revolutionary ends. Like he is clearly not part of that romantic Marxist tradition by any stretch of the imagination. But if you sit down with a lot of Cuban Americans, you'll really struggle to convince them of that. And so, this is why this is an example of why words are important, right? Not and you might say, well, that doesn't make it, that's not a good argument because they're just wrong about that. Well, I mean, you live in a society with them and you want to find a way to communicate with them because, they're not going to these people aren't going to sit through a video like this and actually take the time to learn all these nuanced concepts. So, it's best to find a common language in politics for us all to speak, in a way that doesn't lead to confusion. So I say again, words are important. The words we use are important. So that's my argument for why we should have this conversation. Okay, liberalism. So today when I woke up, just getting on my phone here because I want to remember the thought process that got me thinking about talking about this today. Here we go. Yeah, so Richard Hanania was, he posted a note about Patrick Deneen, and Patrick, wrote a book in 2018, sort of why liberalism failed, which sort of declares bankruptcy on the liberal project, which obviously I take the opposite side of that gamble, that wager. I don't think liberalism has failed. I think it's been a greatly successful project if you look at it on the scale of sort of human history. But I mean, there's actually a lot about his arguments in that book that I agree with, actually. And if you read that book and then say you read some of my recent writing, for example, The Coming Clash of Civilizations, you might sort of recognize some of Deneen's arguments. And he's arguing against liberalism. I'm arguing for it. And so how is it that there's this such strong overlap of arguments? And another sort of post-liberal thinker in the sort of national conservative movement is this guy named N.S. Lyons, and a lot of the same similar stuff there. So what's going on there? Why am I saying liberalism has not failed? In fact, liberalism is the answer to the problems that you attribute to liberalism. I actually think their argument is incoherent. I don't think they understand what liberalism is. I think what they are saying liberalism is what they have observed, in the case of Deneen over the last 70 years, with the rise of neoliberalism, this sort of, I think, from the perspective of sort of thinking about it as intellectual lineage, you might want to call it post-Hayekian liberalism, and which is referring to Friedrich Hayek, and a class. I would call him a classical liberal philosopher, but he was kind of maybe the last sort of classical liberal philosopher of that era, because he kind of sparked, a sort of revolution. I kind of called it liberal materialism in my piece. That's not like something that you'll hear. You won't find that on Wikipedia. That's a word. That's a description I made up to sort of capture this concept. I make no apologies for doing this. How dare I? So I, gave birth to this sort of this idea that's born of like really interesting epistemic insights. Like, we should pause here for a moment and sort of think about what Hayek was saying, because I don't think we should demonize him. I don't think we should vilify him, because on one hand, I'm saying I think he's it was a fantastic and very important mind, and he's kind of in a period, he's growing up in, Mila is asking, like, and I'm calling this sort of this phase of this sort of post Hayekian liberalism of the 20th century. I'm calling it like liberal materialism. You can also call it post Hayekian liberalism. You can neoliberalism is kind of part of it. It's kind of I think what it ultimately grew into in the 80s and 90s. But I mean, but Hayek makes actually some pretty important good arguments that he's actually inspired by. A lot of people don't know this, but I think intellectual history is fun. I do a lot of intellectual history on the circus. If you guys haven't noticed, I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating to think about, like, what was the historical context in which these ideas that became part of these philosophies, like when were they argued? Why were they argued? Like, what was that person thinking about? What were they concerned about when they made that argument? And it's important to do this because sometimes if you're just arguing from conclusion, you may lose a lot of the nuance, which would make you realize that you might want to limit the application of those conclusions if one worries, and one should always worry, that any sort of like stance towards a sort of a solution of a social problem should ever be extended to being totalizing. That's usually incoherent. That's usually problematic. Too much of anything is usually a bad thing. Another way of putting that. So this is, I think, like, why interpreting sort of political philosophy, through the lens of intellectual history, and this is like, there's a lot more of this today, right? Like, Heather Cox Richardson is somebody who really, I think, practices this way of sort of thinking about, politics and philosophy, and it's very useful. David Dudash says, unfortunately, Hayek and Rand have both been embraced by folks like Alan Greenspan. I don't know about the heritage. Well, look, I mean, I want to talk about Hayek. We're gonna have to talk about Hayek for a bit, because I don't think Hayek is somebody who we should delete from the liberal canon. So I'm gonna make an argument today, right, that in philosophy we might call a corrective, right? Not a dismissal, not a Hayek, you were wrong. Frederick Hayek, you weren't wrong in your arguments, but you were incomplete. You made a little mistake here. There was something you didn't think about. And so we're going to argue a corrective today to Hayek. It's not a new one. I've argued it before. There's probably like 4 or 5 essays spread over the last year on Notes from the Circus where I made this argument, but we'll make it again in the context of, the purpose of this discussion, which is sort of really trying to talk about what I think liberalism is, what the liberal tradition is. And I would say that what I'm doing right now is like the pinnacle of the liberal tradition, right? Because the liberal tradition was built upon the notion of what I sometimes call, they didn't call at the time, this is more of a modern term, but epistemic humility, right? another way of saying it in other terms would be the sort of the provisionality of knowledge, the human fallibility, the fallibility of knowledge. The fact that like nobody can apprehend the absolute truth, right? So that's why liberals believe in free speech, because like we might all be wrong. And this one crazy guy screaming in the corner, about, an alien invasion about to happen because, maybe he was visited in the middle of the night and has something to say about a coming alien invasion. Like, I mean, he's probably full of shit. Like, I mean, but maybe he's not, right? It could like seriously be a mistake for us to throw a guy like that in jail, right? Rather than just basically be like, guy, I mean, maybe he's crazy, but let's hear him out, right? That could be like a consequential mistake of human civilization. This is why the Enlightenment philosophers believed in free speech. This is the reason, not because like they thought that we're born with some sort of divine right to say whatever the fuck we want because fuck you. That wasn't their argument. That's a nihilistic argument, and I'm not a fucking nihilist. But that's the argument for free speech, right? In the liberal tradition, right? I mean, modern, like libertarians sort of take it further than that, and they say that you sort of have a natural right to free speech that emanates from, in the sort of the sort of the Misesian and Rothbardian tradition, modern tradition of libertarianism. They make this argument from sort of this metaphysical grounding of sort of basically what you can distill down to what philosophers call libertarian free will. Rothbard basically tries to prove that libertarian free will is something that exists in natural law and can be demonstrated by the application of Ludwig Mises' theory of human action, like praxeology. And so it tries to insist that these things are sort of universals. They're part of natural law. They exist in nature. That before any human being ever existed, all future human beings had a right to free speech. That's the claim. I mean, I'm not I'm not convinced by any natural law claim like that. And I find Rothbard's attempt to sort of prove that it's necessarily true, and then from that necessary truth derive sort of these normative ethics around this idea of self-ownership is like, I mean, I think it's complete nonsense. And the entire Austrian school of economics that's built on top of it is also complete nonsense. Fight me. I'm willing to argue any Austrian or libertarian intellectual on these points. So going back to the liberal tradition, after that little cul-de-sac into libertarianism, you guys enjoying this? You guys enjoying talking about political philosophy? Learning about where all the ideas come from? I certainly enjoy it. So I hope you do too. So free speech, right, is argued for as a social good, because maybe the guy that's screaming about the alien invasion tomorrow isn't crazy, right? I mean, it could happen. It may, like, or maybe the guy saying that going back to sort of one of the famous examples often used by a lot, like sort of in the atheist community criticizing religion, for example, sort of the Catholic Church's prosecution of Galileo Galilei, and his commitment to house arrest for life for making the argument that the Earth went around the sun through sort of observing the movement of the other planets in the solar system, which was threatening to at the time, right, what we call the heliocentric tradition. Not sorry, the not the heliocentric, no, not the heliocentric condition. The heliocentric condition was the new model. Uh, the Earth centric, sort of the Earth centric tradition. Anyways, but that's not like that's actually the good argument for free speech. Because Galileo turned out to be right. So like majority opinion overruled by facts. That's why the Enlightenment liberals were so adamant that we had to have free speech. And it's very clear that this is the argument that's being made if you read John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty. And Mill doesn't have a problem like identifying, limitations on like when you should limit free speech. Mills talks about this, right? For example, like one of the famous examples that John Stuart Mill's sort of thinks about is the mob and stirring up mobs, right? Torches and pitchfork mobs, and he thinks about the sort of the thought experiment of having sort of like some activist person in the community shouting before a crowd that like this carpenter across from that lives in our town and has been fixing our roofs and building our tables has done such shoddy work that all of our houses and furniture are falling apart, and we are angry about this, and we shall march down there today with our torches and pitchforks, and we shall lynch him for what he has done. And John Stuart Mill says, like, we should clearly not allow this. This is clearly getting a mob riled up to the point, which is what Donald Trump did on January 6th, right? Which is like, surely that should be a crime to do that. Which is Mill's argument. A reasonable one, I think. It like when you sort of think about it in these terms, like you think about it, it's like it like this just kind of makes sense, right? But when you're in this like sort of natural law frame of thinking about free speech, it just seems super uncomfortable to stop that guy, because it's like, doesn't he have a right to free speech? I mean, I know that he's rallying up the crowd and he may get that guy killed, but like shutting him up, isn't that dangerous? Isn't that attacking free speech? John Stuart Mill would say, no, it's not dangerous. In fact, like you should turn his microphone off. Obviously microphones didn't exist at the time. I'm modernizing his analogy, his thought experiment. So I mean, this is the classical tradition. We're talking about classical liberalism. When I'm talking to you in the language of classical liberalism right now. And there's another interesting sort of dimension to sort of think about here too, right? Which is what if it is. We're going to go into like a kind of different direction. I'm sure you guys have heard like words like utilitarian before. And words like collectivism and individualism. These are words of great confusion to people who only have a sort of Wikipedia article level understanding of political philosophy. I mean, we need to talk about that here. How do these words apply to everything I've talked about? The way to think about collectivism and individualism is, I would say, some people will disagree with me on this, but this is my view. I think these are better thought of as analytical categories. not as normative categories. I think it's incoherent to think about them as normative categories. I mean, they could they're like, I mean, in some sense, it's like they're kind of, it's unavoidable because like if you're talking about like collectivism, sort of like at the limit, and individualism at the limit, then that is a normative distinction, to be clear. But I think there's sort of like a weird sort of like thing about that, which is that like we never actually reason about these things at the limit. So thinking about them as normative categories, I think just like always steers you wrong. And I'll give you an example of why. So like one of the temptations that one has when thinking about collectivism and individualism, this is like not just a temptation, it's kind of the way in which like sort of popular politics thought about it in the Cold War period, and even still today, less so today, like with younger generations that are sort of like removed from the sort of the Cold War thinking, but among sort of like, you know, older boomers like myself, Gen X, the baby boomer generation, they gathered an intuition about like I mean if you were in a, to be clear, like political philosophers and we're in at, you know, at Harvard and Princeton and Brown and you know, even the hippies at Reed College on the West Coast. I mean, they were never like confused about this, like ever. This was always only a confusion in public discourse. You know, like Ronald Reagan was confused about this, like clearly. Like I know that will offend some conservative, but he was confused about this. And so the sort of the temptation was to sort of think about that, like collectivism is just another way of saying Marxism, and individualism is just another way of saying liberalism, classical liberalism, or libertarianism. And that's how most semi-politically literate adults in America think about this. And this is what in philosophy we would call a category mistake, right? I mean, it's actually like worse than a mistake. It's like category. It's like just complete category confusion. But it's a category mistake because, and when you commit a category mistake, the consequences are that you will, by definition, end up at a sort of an incoherent like result, and there will be, you know, sort of impossibility, unnecessary, you might say, in like information theory or in like sort of mathematics, like impossibility results in the reasoning. So what's a category mistake here? Well, I mean, as I said before, right, collectivism is really kind of like an analytical category that sort of speaks to like whether the normative claim, the sort of the normative, yeah, I mean the claim to sort of like a normative right, and sort of like sort of political rights theory, which is like usually sort of like how you're like applying this. You're saying that this is a right that sort of like applies on behalf of the group, right? So which may by definition limit the right of the individual, right? So let's think about that. So if there's a collective right to healthcare, for example, then that may have the consequence of limiting individual rights to keep more of their money, because we'll have to tax more of it, and this will be redistributionary. So like that's a collectivist right, surely, no disagreement. But does that make it Marxist? I mean, that's the intuition that sort of, you know, like even people on the left have that intuition. That's like why a lot of people on the left call themselves socialists, because they internalize that category mistake as well in sort of thinking about it that way. But that's like not like correct, right? Because like both Marxism and liberalism both have features that can be analytically described as both collectivist and individualist, right? Like so like the easy example in liberalism, right, is that we all have the right to, you know, like a fair trial. We all have the right to a fair trial. Okay? That's a collective right. It's a collective right. It's not individual. Like, and it's a collective right because it implies the existence of a social institution, the courts, that has to be run by a government. And those courts have to be able to enforce their orders. So there has to be police, right? That will take you to jail if you don't follow a court order, right? Or that you violate the law. That's all. Like that right to justice is a collective right, which impedes on individual rights. Both liberalism and Marxism have collectivist and individualist features. So this is why thinking about liberalism as individualism and Marxism as collectivism is a category mistake or a category error. These categories don't mean the same thing. Anyways, I mean, people don't understand this, and it's really frustrating when you do understand this, and you have to, like, you know, you watch like the Talking Heads shows, or you watch like Piers Morgan Uncensored, and you see, you know, political talking heads like talking about these concepts, and you're just like, these guys have no idea what the fuck they're talking about. But no one knows they don't know what the fuck they're talking about because it sounds intelligent, because they're saying these words, but they don't really know what they mean. I don't know. I hope you guys are enjoying this. I feel like I'm getting a lot off my chest. My sort of internal existential frustration about, you know, political like what people understand about political philosophy and liberalism. Anyways, where you know where to go from here. So yeah, I mean, so this goes back to the thing that I brought up about Richard Hanania's piece on Substack Notes, and Patrick Deneen's intervention about liberalism and how it's failed, and how what he's really criticizing, I think, right, is American consumer culture, neoliberalism. You know, he talks about the abandonment of the public good. I agree with him. I agree that with him that, you know, what I call sort of what we can call neoliberalism, or sort of in its more extreme form, hyper neoliberalism, which is what we're seeing with you know, revolutionary monarchist figures like Peter Thiel and like Mark Andreessen and these titans of capital, is yes, the abandonment of the idea of the common good. It's a cynical view that that you can't escape the realities of power, and that democratic contestation is just unnecessary inefficiency. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree with Patrick Deneen about that liberal excess. We should call it liberal excess. And but where did Hayek go wrong? Where did he go wrong? So Ludwig von Mises, you know, put forward sort of a conjecture, an economic conjecture known as the economic calculation problem. And this is a, you know, when you're, it's an epistemic argument about the limits of knowledge. It's actually like a generalizable generalizable claim that actually applies across actually many different dimensions within science and economics and the social sciences more generally. Um, it relates back to philosophical insights, the Humean insight, right? Hume's guillotine, the Izzat problem, the fact value distinction, and it is it's actually Mises didn't really kind of come up with it on his own. Actually, he was existing in the same world as sort of the quantum physics revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. And so this is the time of Einstein and Niels Bohr. um and it's actually from this world that Mises will get the idea for framing the economic calculation problem, because he's borrowing the idea from what is known in quantum physics as the measurement problem. And it has to do with the sort of it's the problem that, like, in order to measure a system in quantum physics, you have to necessarily interact with that system, and through interacting with that system, you are forced into making a trade-off in, like, what you can know, right? So like you can know the momentum of a particle or its position, but never both. And so this is the sort of this is like, this is, if you've taken physics 101, you've heard this before. If you've done sort of like advanced physics even at the high school level, you might be familiar with this. And this is the insight that inspires Ludwig von Mises to frame the economic calculation problem, which is like actually a critique of socialist central planning. And the observation sort of being that, like, economic systems sort of suffer from the same problem that quantum systems do. And so this sort of this information theory he's sort of developing about social systems, economic systems, is a sort of a problem that actually scales into this domain. He's right about this, by the way, and this is why modern socialists agree with him about this, which is why you now have which is why all sort of modern forms of socialism are market socialism. So, like, this is actually important to recognize. This is where modern socialists, like even like Zoran Mamdani, or even sort of liberal socialists like Matthew McManus and all these other folks, like, they actually converge on this sort of market socialist structure. They're agreeing with Hayek and Mises here. You have to recognize this, that that in this case socialists are actually borrowing from Hayek and Mises' insight, which goes all the way back to sort of like Niels Bohr, right? And so this is why understanding intellectual history is so important, right? It gives you a different perspective and actually might make you more sympathetic, right? Because you might think to yourself, oh, Hayek and Mises are the guys that kind of gave us this neoliberal consumerist hellhole. But they didn't, you don't know what they would have thought today. They might be, you have no idea. Mises might, if he stepped out of a time machine today and viewed everything based on like where he was, he might vote for Zoran Mamdani. You don't know, right? Like, they were reasoning, I think these were intellectually honest people that were trying to understand the world. So that's that kind of takes us to, like, what is the corrective? Like, what's the sort of the intellectual, like, intervention here, right? The intellectual intervention here is that and is that like Hayek, and by the way, I don't think Hayek was completely wrong. I mean, he believed in the idea of a welfare state in Road to Serfdom. I mean, it's kind of a almost a footnote in Road to Serfdom, but like he thought that like, you know, like he would have like not he wouldn't object to the earned income tax credit or food stamps or anything. Like he thought that that was probably something a state should do, right? And so Hayek can be overly dismissed by leftists as sort of being this market fundamentalist. He really wasn't that, really. I mean, that's not true. Which is why I would still say that like he still counts as a classical liberal, even though his ideas, which I argue in some ways were bastardized by libertarians and neoliberals, and sort of extended to extremes in the 1980s and 1990s, you know, and led to sort of the market excesses, like the sort of the deregulation of the banks, which led us to the 2008 financial crisis. We're making a similar mistake right now with crypto, by the way. We are making a huge mistake with that. Which is when crypto is definitely an example of hyper neoliberalism, by any stretch of the imagination. And we should absolutely do something about it before it becomes big enough to blow up the global economy and lead us into another Great Depression. We should do something about that. So yeah, that's my that would be my sort of corrective that I would add there, that the mistake made was that, like, you know, social, environmental, and political externalities associated with unrestrained markets are a danger to Democratic or Republican government. And it's, you know, and if you were to bring James Madison, you know, who wrote, you know, Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution, in a time machine, and were to show him all this, he would be like, yeah, man, this is why there's a fucking commerce clause. Like, that's what I mean. He would be like, have any of you modern folk heard of the British East India Company? What went down in Boston Harbor? And so, I mean, so I think that this is why I would argue that the liberal tradition here has not failed. In fact, we can find our arguments within liberalism as to what went wrong, and we can issue that corrective. That's my project, guys. That's why I started Notes from the Circus, rather than like talking about all this bullshit that we have to talk about every day. But I will keep talking about it. I know people enjoy it. But that's the philosophical worldview through which I speak. Maybe we can, you know, maybe we can get into maybe talking about my critiques of socialism or libertarianism more deeply later. Maybe I hope you'll find them as equally interesting. But for today, doing a monologue for 1 straight hour, guys, is like a lot. I didn't like. It's much easier when you're like have someone else, and so you can kind of take turns talking. Gives yourself to have a break. I don't realize I get so tired, and I get a. I don't normally get headaches, but when I do a 1 hour monologue with you, I actually start to get a headache, and that's where I'm getting to right now, which means that my discomfort is now exceeding my capacity for generosity to lend you my time. I hope you'll understand. So I think it's time for me to finish this one up. For those who joined late and want to try and catch the beginning, I'll be posting the recording probably in the next few hours. Thank you guys for watching, listening. Hope you learned something. If you think if you think I was stupid and wrong and was talking about my ass in any of this, feel free to reach out. I'll happy to debate you on a Substack Live. think we need more healthy debate about these kinds of big ideas. So that's me. Have a happy Saturday, everybody, and I'll see you again tomorrow. We'll talk more about the week's events.